Hello, and welcome to Lesson 12 of this companion series to A.K. Warder's Grammar Guide, An Introduction to Pali. Now, Lesson 12 deals with three big subjects that I think are going to be too long to squeeze into one tutorial, and so I've split the chapter into two parts. This is Part 1, where we look at the dative case, and Part 2, which will follow, will cover relative clauses and pronouns, etc. Okay. This is Pali Studies on the Learn Pali channel. So, we're going to begin Lesson 12 with a look at the dative case, both how it's formed and how it's used. The term dative comes from the Latin dativus, meaning to give, and the dative noun answers the question to whom or what, for whom or what something is done or given, and so corresponds to the English prepositions to and for. You give to another, or you do something for another. So it generally indicates the recipient or beneficiary of something. But when we come to look at the declensional endings, Pali has very much lost the distinction between the dative and the genitive forms. In fact, the dative has pretty much been subsumed by the genitive case, which acts in its place. This means that the dative case endings are the same as the genitive, except for one form in the masculine and neuter singular, ea. And note, I've rearranged the layout of the stem declension table from the previous lessons. This hopefully makes it a bit simpler. So, with the exception of that one ending in the neuter and masculine singular, the dative and the genitive forms are the same, and this can make them hard to distinguish. But in practice, this is seldom necessary, as the meanings are often quite close to each other. If we recall last week's example from the Dhammapada, the preposition of here comes from reading the noun case as genitive, but we could equally take the dative, long is the night for one awake. Hopefully you can see they're very similar. So let's now look at how the dative case can be used. That old dative ending in ea is almost exclusively used to denote intention or purpose, and is largely synonymous with an infinitive, in order to do something. So this example literally is, the gods have assembled for seeing the Tathagata, or have assembled in order to see the Tathagata. Now, some grammar guides regard the ea ending as being the only true dative, and so conclude that intention and purpose is the only true meaning of the dative case. However, other authors are more liberal, and this results in different classifications. Some guides place a function with the genitive, whilst others place it with the dative, so you may find a difference between grammar guides. For instance, the function of to have is placed by some authors with the genitive and some authors in the dative. But whether we read this as the goats are of the Brahmin or for the Brahmin, it's irrelevant really, as long as we understand that the Brahmin has goats. But we're jumping ahead a bit. One of the major functions attributed to the dative case is that of recipient. For example, marking the person to whom something is given. Wise men give gifts to recluses. And this shows the general sense of the dative, indicating the person or thing that gains benefit. The Tathagata taught the Dharma to the monks. And so the dative noun is often equated with indirect objects grammatically. So we can render these, the wise men give recluses gifts, and the Tathagata taught the monks the Dharma, placing the noun as the indirect object rather than using the preposition to. But it's important to understand that the dative case isn't restricted to this, and it may be better understood as simply a beneficial relationship. For instance, it can be used negatively. This is not for him. And a number of individual verbs take dative nouns as objects. So we have kamati, to please, and the person pleased will be in the dative case. the same verb can actually also mean to forgive. And if it's a person that's been forgiven, this person will be in the dative case. But if it's an action or an indiscretion, then the indiscretion goes in the accusative case as a direct object. And we can see the same is true with verbs to agree or to wait on. The person agreed with or waited on is in the dative case, because they are the ones benefiting. This quality is true of many causative verbs too, like to owe or to support. The person owed or supported will be in the dative case. And the same is true of the verb to inform. The person informed is seen as benefiting, and so is in the dative case. But interestingly, the dative is also used with verbs of praising, blaming, and anger. For instance, the verb to get angry, the person with whom we get angry is in the dative. And the same is true of the verb to swear or curse at someone. The person cursed at is in the dative case. Well, hopefully you get the idea. Usually the person benefiting from something is placed in the dative case. Warder lists several other varieties of use, but I'm not going to go into them here. One final point on the dative case is that there are a few dative nouns used adverbially. Well, that completes our look at the dative case. Let's move on now to look at the aorist of the verb sue. So we can see from Warder's paradigm that the root is generally in its strengthened form and takes the augment. To this, the third form of aorist endings outlined by Warder back in lesson 4 are applied, but we can see that the paradigm's a little irregular, as the first and second plural forms have the weak root. But that said, they're easy enough to recognise as they have the characteristic aorist endings. Well, that's as far as I'm going to go in this tutorial. In part 2, we'll return to look at the relative and interrogative pronouns. There are already a couple of tutorials covering the basics of these pronouns, so in the meantime, why not get ahead and check them out?